the question I kind of use as a title tonight is it worth it? Is it worth it? I want you to just think about that question. Is it worth it? All right? So we'll pick up at verses 1 and 2 in chapter 14. It says, Now at Iconium they entered together into the Jewish synagogue and spoke in such a way that a great number of both Jews and Greeks believed. But the unbelieving Jews stirred up the Gentiles and poisoned their minds against the brothers. All right, so this is nothing new, right? This has kind of been the pattern. They go into a city, they go into a town, they find the synagogue. Why a synagogue? That's where people gather, for one thing. And that's where a large group of Jewish people would gather. And so Paul, of course, Barnabas would find people they would have something in common with as a starting point to have the gospel conversation with them, to talk about Jesus. So initially, as we see in Acts, even though later on we know that Paul referred to himself as the apostle to the Gentiles, early on in Acts, he's really emphasizing a ministry to Jewish people, right? It's not until later that we see him moving on to the Gentiles. But the synagogue was a base of evangelism in each town that they went to. And of course, the pattern we see is the same pattern we see today. Some people listen and believe. Some people hear what's said and they reject it, right? They don't listen. But you also have the element when Paul and Barnabas was preaching, they stirred up trouble and caused other people to get angry and to cause trouble and to experience violence against the apostles. So this is nothing new, of course. This is something that's been going on since they've been preaching the gospel. But you see this pattern happening everywhere they go. Now, verse 3, it says, So, that might be better translated, nevertheless. Even though this is happening, it didn't stop them from continuing to preach the gospel. So, nevertheless, they remained for a long time, speaking boldly for the Lord, who bore witness to the word of his grace, granting signs and wonders to be done by their hands. So, despite the attempts by these Jewish opponents to really just shut them up or do them in, right? They refused to retreat from the persecution. All right, any Tom Petty and the Heartbreaker fans in here? Oh, I won't back down. And that could have been Paul and Barnabas singing that, right? I won't back down. The greater opposition always kindles greater boldness. And you see that in the apostles. The more people came against them, the more people tried to shut them up. Remember early on we talked about this when Peter and John were arrested and they were put in jail and they were beaten. And then the authorities said, you can't preach Jesus anymore. You can't talk about Jesus. What did they say? Yeah, we're not going to shut up. Right. You can't stop us. Right? We can't help but to talk about Jesus. So you do what you think is right. We're going to keep talking about Jesus. So opposition to the message is countered by what? What do the apostles keep talking about? Jesus, but they're showing grace, right? They're still talking about grace. And the message is, at this point, still being accompanied with signs and wonders. So the same things that you see the early apostles doing, then you see it happening again through Peter. Now it's happening through Paul and Barnabas. These signs and wonders, these miracles are taking place. And so the Lord is doing this. Remember, this is the Lord. This is not about Paul and Barnabas. This is about they're obedient to the Lord, but God is the one doing this work. And then you get down to verses 4 and 5, there's a divided response. The people of the city were divided. Now, this is not just Jews. These are Gentiles too. Some sided with the Jews and some with the apostles. When an attempt was made by both Gentiles and Jews with their rulers to mistreat them and to stone them. And so let's just stop right there. Remember, the Gentiles are involved at this point too. So this is spreading. This is causing an uproar in the city itself. So what was their plan? Some sided with the Jews. That means some of the people said, no, we need to get rid of Paul and Barnabas. We need to shut them up. We need to get rid of this Christianity. But some of them sided with the apostles. Now, of course, if you have some siding with one side and some siding with other, there's going to be people in that town that aren't going to see eye to eye anymore, right? So they come up with a plan. What are they going to do with these apostles? It says an attempt was made by both Gentiles and Jews with their rulers to mistreat them and to stone them. And then they learned of it and fled to Lystra and Derbe, cities of Lycaonia, and to the surrounding country. And there they continued to preach the gospel. Now, the apostles, in this case, namely Paul and Barnabas, they were bold, right? They weren't backing down because of persecution. They didn't allow the authorities, they didn't allow the people, they didn't allow the people at the synagogue to shut them up. However, they were bold, but they were not reckless. Okay? They were called to be witnesses, right? It wasn't just a reckless throwing away their lives. They were to be obedient. And if they had to give their lives, they were prepared to do that. We've already seen some of the apostles already did that. Stephen, for example. James was another one. But they're not reckless. And so everywhere they go, as a result of this persecution, what's happening?
People getting saved.
The gospel's being spread, right? People are responding. More and more people are coming to Christ. The witness is going out. Now, the interesting word that we have here, the Greek word for witness, okay? We're all called to be witnesses for Jesus. But you know what the Greek word for witness is? Martyros, which is where we get the word martyr from, right? And of course, logically, for a lot of these people, because they were faithful witnesses, they ended up becoming victims. And so it wasn't long before the word martyr meant you were giving your life for Jesus. But technically, martyr simply means witness. And so they were definitely, whether they gave their lives or not, they were being faithful witnesses. All right, so any questions up to this point? The main thing we see here is the gospel spread and the Holy Spirit's on the move. Now, when you get to verses 8 through 10, you're going to see their faith in action. You're going to see not just the apostles, but you're going to see somebody else putting their faith in what Jesus could do. It says, now at Lystra there was a man sitting who could not use his feet. This means he was crippled. He could not walk. He was crippled from birth, and it says that he had never walked. So he had no experience in that. He had never experienced walking on his own, right? He always had to have help. He was there. Why was he there? Begging, right? He had to depend on people to help him. But he listened to Paul speaking, and Paul, looking intently at him and seeing that he had faith to be made well, said in a loud voice, "Stand upright on your feet." And he sprang up and began walking. Now, where have we heard very similar thing that had happened before? Jesus. Jesus did this, right? Jesus actually did this a number of times. And he would see somebody who was begging, he'd see somebody who was crippled, who couldn't walk, who was lame, and he'd say, "Get up," right? Get up, take up your mat and walk. And what happened? They were healed, right? Jesus healed people. Then earlier in Acts, we saw Peter do the same thing, right? We even see the same language being used by Luke. Peter gazing intently at them and said, "What do you want?" Get up and walk. And another miracle takes place. Now it's happening through Paul. Paul says, "Stand up on your feet." And he says he sprang up and began walking. Now, here's why I say it's faith in action. Now, Paul could have looked at this guy and said, "Get up," knowing that he was crippled, knowing that he had never walked. He could have said, "Get up." And the guy could have said, "No, I can't do that." Or, "I've never been able to walk before." But he didn't give any excuses, right? Paul recognized that this guy was listening to what he was saying. We're not given all the details of what Paul said. We're not given but we know he was preaching the gospel. We know he was talking about Jesus. And so the guy is listening, and Paul realizes that. And so he gets his attention and says, "Get up." And the guy did it. Now that right there takes faith, right? It takes faith to even attempt such a thing. But it wasn't just, "I believe what you're saying," right? We've been talking about this on Sundays. It wasn't just that. He actually followed through and took that step, right? And look what happened as a result. He was healed. He sprang up immediately, and began walking. Now, this is a remarkable thing. And we know it's a remarkable thing because it is a miracle, right?
Yes.
But this takes place in sight of a lot of people. There's a crowd gathered around. All right, so let's continue. Look at verses 11 through 13. This is where it gets real interesting, if it wasn't interesting enough already. When the crowd saw what Paul had done, they lifted up their voices, saying in Lycaonian. So this would be a dialect of another language, right? So even though it's based on Greek, it's a local dialect. The gods have come down to us in the likeness of men. Barnabas they called Zeus, and Paul Hermes, because he was the chief speaker. And the priest of Zeus, whose temple was at the entrance of the city, brought oxen and garlands to the gates and wanted to offer sacrifice with the crowds. So immediately they see this guy they have known their whole life, has never walked a day in his life, see him all of a sudden spring up and he's walking around, and immediately what are they wanting to do?
They're their own God.
They want to worship Paul and Barnabas.
Oh.
They call them Zeus and Hermes, which would be two of the chief gods, Zeus being the chief god over all the gods in their culture. And then Hermes was the chief messenger god. He was the chief speaker. Obviously, Paul was doing the speaking at this point. That's why they associated him with Hermes. Now, it gets a little bit more interesting when you know the background for the city of Lystra. Okay? So, prior to this, in their own folklore, okay, in their own beliefs, which have been passed down, they actually believed that Zeus and Hermes had visited their town. And the only people that welcomed them in, they were disguised as humans. Only people that welcomed them in was an elderly couple who welcomed them into their, now this is not real, mind you. This is in their folklore. This is what they believed. Welcomed them in their home. And so Zeus and Hermes rewarded this couple, this poor couple, richly. Blessed them immensely. And then all the people that rejected them and turned them away, he punished. So they're already primed for this type of belief in their own local folklore. Now, on top of that, one of the most popular writings at the time, anybody guess? The Iliad. You're exactly right. A man named Homer. The Iliad was very influential on their culture and in their belief system. All right, so over and over again, Homer talks about gods appearing as people and showing up in places. And one of the things you better do when the gods show up is sacrifice to them, right? So with all that said, here's Paul and Barnabas. A miracle happens in sight of everybody. And this time, they're like, we're not waiting. We're going to make a sacrifice right now. We're going to worship him. We're not going to make the mistake as their story, their folklore seemed to be. And so they have been conditioned for this. Now, what is Paul and Barnabas' response? All right, so they're going to make the sacrifice. But look at verse 14. When the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard it, they tore their garments and rushed out into the crowd, crying out, "Men, why are you doing these things? We also are men of like nature with you, and we bring you good news that you should turn from these vain things to a living God, who made the heaven and the earth and the sea and all that is in them. In past generations he allowed all the nations to walk in their own ways, yet he did not leave himself without witness. For he did good by giving you rain from heaven and fruitful seasons, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness." Even with these words, they scarcely restrained the people from offering sacrifice to them. So the apostles, Paul and Barnabas, they are appalled, right? Once they understood what was happening, because remember, they're speaking a different dialect. So they had to get some idea of what in the world are these people doing. But once they realized what they're doing, they did everything in their power to stop it, right? And why is that?
They wanted to know they weren't gods.
They were not gods, right? They're not gods. They're saying, we're flesh and blood like you. We're just people. Don't do what you're about to do. And they didn't stop there, did they? What else did they talk about?
Talked about the one true God.
Right. They talked about the one true God. They basically told these people, you have been wrong your whole life. But now God is giving you an opportunity to believe in Him, to trust Him. In other words, change from your foolishness and turn to the truth before it's too late, right? So they're calling these people to repent. And so once they realized what was happening, they put a stop to it. And in the process of trying to stop it, what do they do to their clothes? They tear their clothes. Now, this may have been a foreign idea to this Greek culture, but the Jews understood completely what was going on. Usually when someone tears their clothes, it's an extreme display of horror, right, of what's taking place. A lot of times when someone is thought to be blaspheming, what do? They tear their clothes at the horror of death. So they tore their clothes. They won't accept the adoration. They won't accept the glory that they know only belongs to God, right? Glory only belongs to God. And so the Lord, not Paul and Barnabas, caused this miracle. And so that's what they want the people to know. It's not us. It's the one true God. And so they call what the people did and believed, they called it worthless and futile. Now, if you want to make friends and you go into a new town and you find a crowd of people, probably not the first thing that you're going to do is say, you are all worthless and you're futile. But that's what they did. Because they saw Paul and Barnabas, they knew the difference Jesus makes. They wanted that same difference for everybody else too. The basic idea there is idolatry and Christianity cannot coexist. They can't go together. And we've had lots of people, lots of cultures even, that's tried to put that together. We have denominations that's trying to do that.
That's right.
But it won't work. It can't work. God will not give His glory to another. And so we see that's what Paul and Barnabas are dealing with here. And they ask the people, in fact, they tell the people, you need to get rid of your false gods. You need to get rid of all these things and turn to the true living God. Now, let me ask you a question. Did Paul and Barnabas, at this point, were they concerned about these people's feelings? Were they concerned about hurting their feelings or offending them? No, I think they were trying to, right? They were trying to get their attention. Like, y'all are way off base. You need to know the truth. But they spoke the truth, right? They didn't just say, don't worship us. We're just people like you, and just kind of quietly disappear. They said, look, we're not gods, but we know the one true God. And you need to turn to the one true God. And so they do this, and they're motivated by love in what they're doing. All right, look at verses 19 and 20. The Jews came from Antioch and Iconium, and having persuaded the crowds, they stoned Paul and dragged him out of the city, supposing that he was dead. But when the disciples gathered about him, he rose up and entered the city, and on the next day he went on with Barnabas to Derbe. Now this is what, these two verses just really strikes me. Because one moment the crowd is ready to offer sacrifices to Paul and Barnabas as gods. And it's immediate. They've changed their mind, and now they're going to stone Paul. Now, we don't know what happened to Barnabas at this point. We don't know what they did to him. He's not mentioned. But we know that they took Paul out, they stoned him, and they actually thought that Paul was dead, right? They left him dead on the road. But what happens? It says that the disciples, that means the believers there, gathered around him. He rose up and entered the city, and on the next day he went on with Barnabas to Derbe. So he meets back up with Barnabas, and they start on a journey back to the cities that they had come from. So they're making another circle back around. Now, just a thought here. They stoned Paul to kill him. That was their intent. Paul, they think, is laying dead on the ground. The disciples come, and they're coming to bury him, right? They think he's dead too. And all of a sudden, Paul just gets up, brushes himself off, and limps back into the city. Now, can you imagine, just for a moment, these people that tried to kill Paul? They thought they had done away with him. And they're just living their life. They're celebrating. They're probably high-fiving people when they meet them. So glad we dealt with that problem. And they look up and they say, who is that? they couldn't kill him because it wasn't his time. And Jesus said a lot of things about that too. I'm reading, it's really a kid's book, but I've been enjoying them so much. It's a serial. It's called One Piece. It's many volumes. I don't know how many volumes they're into now. But there's a character in there named Luffy, and he's like the main character. And the story is he ate a fruit that caused him to be like a rubber man. So he can stretch and he can bend and he can do all these things. And so one of his main enemies is a guy named Mr. Crocodile. And Mr. Crocodile is a mean, fierce pirate. No one can kill him. No one can harm him. He does all this damage to people. And Mr. Crocodile thought he had killed Luffy 3 times. And he just kept coming back. And he said, what? I thought I killed you. And I just can't get rid of you. That's what I think of when I see Paul just getting up and just walking back into the city. And I just can imagine their reaction when they see Paul again. Like, what is going on? Which, if I were in their shoes, if I had been one of those people, you guarantee it would cause me to stop and think, am I doing the right thing here? Am I off base? Maybe what Paul is doing is the right thing and I'm wrong, right? I would definitely stop and think and reconsider my life. So the Lord, saved Paul. He spared Paul, of course, and even while he was nursing his wounds, what is he doing? Even while he's limping, what is he doing? He goes on. What's his intent? To preach the gospel. He's going to share the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christ, with as many people as they possibly can. Now, one more thought I had. As these people are picking up stones to throw at Paul, I wonder if he thought about Stephen. Remember, it was Paul who approved of the stoning of Stephen.
That's right.
He saw Stephen's reaction. He saw and heard what Stephen said. And I just can't help but wonder. I know it had to enter into his mind at that point. So where do these people come from, though, that come and stir up this trouble? Where do they come from?
They just left.
Yeah, where they just came from, right? They came from Antioch and Iconium. And here they are again. They're showing up, and it's like a posse, right? They're here to take care of Paul and get rid of him. So the apostles at this point, though, are going to circle back, and they're going to go back through the cities that they've already been. And everywhere they go, they're still going to encounter threats. It's still going to be dangerous, right? But despite all the dangers, they're still faithful witnesses. They keep on telling about Jesus. And then you get to verses 24 through 28. They passed through Pisidia and came to Pamphylia. When they had spoken the word at Perga, they went down to Attalia. From there they sailed to Antioch, where they had been commended to the grace of God for the work that they had fulfilled. And when they arrived and gathered the church together, they declared all that God had done with them and how he had opened the door of faith to the Gentiles. And they remained no little time with the disciples. Why Luke expresses things the way he does sometimes. He didn't just say they spent a lot of time there. They spent no little time. It means they were there for a while. Now, you see this happening, right? They give this report, and they don't really, I'm sure it came up. I'm sure people ask questions. I'm sure they had to tell all the stories about what happened to them. But what are they emphasizing here in their report? What are they emphasizing? The grace of God, right? How God had opened the door of faith to the Gentiles too. Now this sets the stage for chapter 15, which is the Jerusalem Council, right? Oh, wait a minute. Gentiles are coming to God. Gentiles are believing in Jesus. We got to ask about this. And so they had this big meeting, and we'll get to that. But back to my first question we started with. Is it worth it? Was it worth it for Paul to go to Lystra and be stoned? Almost stoned to death, right? Was it worth it? Was it all for nothing but trouble and for severe bruising that almost left him dead? Well, I submit to you that it was worth it. And we see some of the fruit come out of it because a good part of the New Testament is spent with another person we talk about from time to time, a young man named Timothy. Guess where Timothy is from? Lystra. The same city where Paul experienced all this persecution. Now, I had some of you read some verses. I hope you have those ready. First is Acts 16, 1 through 3.
Got that? Paul came also to Derbe and Lystra. A disciple was there named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was a Greek. He was well spoken of by the brothers of Lystra and Iconium. Paul wanted Timothy to accompany him, and he took him and circumcised him because of the Jews who were in those places, for they all knew that his father was a Greek.
Okay, so when Paul goes back to Lystra, he meets Timothy, who's already a disciple. He's already a believer in Christ, right? Now, 2 Timothy 3, 10 through 11.
You, however, know about my teaching, my way of life, my purpose, faith, patience, love, endurance, persecutions, sufferings, what kinds of things happened to me in Antioch, Iconium, and Lystra. The persecutions I endured, yet the Lord rescued me from all of them.
That's right. And remember, Paul's writing this letter that she just read from to Timothy. And he's reminding Timothy, Timothy, you know what I went through. You know what I encountered and endured when I went to Lystra. You saw it, Timothy, but the Lord was good through it all. How about 1 Corinthians 4:17?
For this reason I am sending to you Timothy, my son, whom I love, who is faithful in the Lord. He will remind you of my way of life in Christ, which agrees with what I teach everyone in every church.
That's right. So Corinth was one of those cities early on that Paul was writing to. But here he's saying, I'm going to send you Timothy. Now, Paul trusted Timothy enough to send him to one of the churches that had the worst reputation to go and help deal with the things that they were dealing with. And so, was it worth it? It was. Absolutely. How about Philippians 2:22?
That's me. But you know of his proven worth, that he served with me in the furtherance of the gospel like a child serving his father.
Yeah, so he's talking about Timothy there again. He was so close to Paul, but Paul's like, this is like just like a copy of me. He's going out and doing the same kinds of things. So yes, it absolutely is worth it. Is persecution worth it?
Yes.
When we experience bad things, where's our comfort? Who has Romans 8:28?
And we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose.
Okay. Paul went to Lystra and experienced those terrible things, experienced almost death. But God used that to lead many people to Christ, including a man named Timothy who went on to do a lot of ministry with Paul and without Paul. So God will use circumstances. God will use things that happen to us for our good and for his glory. And then the last verse is Galatians 6:9.
And let us not grow weary while doing good, for in due season we shall reap if we do not lose heart.
That's right. So I just wanted us to read that one as a reminder to us all. Don't give up doing good. You may not see fruit for a while, but if you're faithful and you keep on doing it, you're going to see fruit. God is going to use it, and God's going to use it for good. So don't ever give up, even if things get hard, even if persecution happens because we're believers in Jesus. Don't give up, because we'll reap a harvest. And Paul, I don't know what he was faced with, mentally. I don't know the temptations that he had to just walk away from it all. He always claimed, I'm not ashamed of the gospel. He told the Romans that. But what if Paul would have gotten tired of being beat up and just said, it's not worth it, I'm walking away? What would have happened? We don't really know, right? We don't really know. But we know what happened because he was faithful. And that's the point. Any questions or comments that y'all want to add?